Hey everybody, here we are for the next lecture in the series, and it's called Growing Pains. It's about how these guys figured out how to run a country, and it's going to create a lot of conflict and a lot of challenges. So basically, we're going to take a look at four presidents and some of the stuff that went on during this period of time. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison are the ones covered in this particular lecture. So let's start with George Washington. We've said a lot about George Washington already in our lectures because George Washington figures so heavily in everything from the French Indian War, of course, to the American Revolution. And then now that they created the Constitution, they had their little election and they told George, hey, you're the president. And he kind of went, what does that mean? And they said, I don't know, figure it out. And that's sort of what George Washington has had to do. He had to do it as general of the army. Now he has to do it again as president of the United States. He is the only president ever unanimously elected, and he was unanimously elected twice. And he's sort of course, a national hero. Like I said in other lectures, he'd be the first G.I. Joe if we had him at the time. He's a guy everyone loves, everyone respects. If you've been following the lectures pretty closely and you've noted the various pictures I've shown of George Washington, you might note here he's looking pretty old. This one was done toward the end of his presidency. It's one of the more famous pictures of Washington. So he's referred to sometimes as first in war, first in peace. He's referred to as the father of our country. And in many ways, he personally just epitomizes everything that America is about. And it just should be noted here that everything George Washington does will be magnified throughout history because he's first. He's the first president. Every act he takes, the way he acts, everything is going to become a precedent for future presidents, even to him stepping down after 2 terms. So he knows this. And Washington's a pretty private person, but he's also a commanding figure. He's also a servant of the people. I mean, he has to unretire several times in order to go to war and serve in Congress and go to the Constitutional Convention and now become president. And so he's someone that everyone looks up to. He himself is pretty reserved, but everyone looks up to him. Everyone appreciates him. So one of the things that happens, of course, as the government is formed, right? States created their, or I should rather say, selected or elected their congressmen, right? Their 2 senators and their congressmen. They go to, sometimes they're in Philadelphia, sometimes they're in New York. Eventually they end up in what's called Washington, D.C. now, but not until after George Washington is gone. But the Congress, in addition to setting up the judges and doing the Bill of Rights and a whole host of other things, also creates these departments. So we have a State Department, Treasury Department, War Department, and Justice Department. And Washington gets to pick who those guys are. So he picks Thomas Jefferson for the state. He picks Alexander Hamilton for the Treasury Department. He picks Henry Knox to be the War Department head, and he picks Edmund Randolph to be his Attorney General. And some have said this is probably the best team of cabinet members we've ever had. Certainly it's Washington's A-team of trusted men. These were all people he knew. These were all people he was familiar with. These were people, many of them, Knox and Hamilton for sure, served with him during the war. Knox was a very trusted officer in Washington's army, and a very heroic one, I should add. And so Washington picks the guys to run his departments. Remember, he's the boss. They are then the boss of their respective department, and they report to him. So the cabinet is not a name that shows up anywhere in the Constitution. It's a name that was kind of given to this group of people, and it stuck, right? Now you might think, okay, now we got Washington in charge. He's the civilian governor, president of the country, and everything's going to be great, but it's not. There's still huge problems. I mean, the reality is nobody really knows what they're doing, right? Nobody really understands how all this is going to work. And so they're sort of guessing, and they're trying to make it work, and they're taking all the parts of the Constitution, which Remember, if you read it, it's actually very, very short. There's very little substance to it, although it's super important, of course. It doesn't have a long list of rules and this, that, and the other. You can read it in just a few minutes. So they kind of have to figure out, well, what do all these words mean? Now that we're actually putting things in practice, the rubber hits the road, what actually happens? So that'll breed a lot of conflict just by itself. But there's other things still going on in the world, and the U.S. now has to react to those things, or in some ways be a part of those things, right? Up until now, we've been colonial parts of the British Empire, and we reacted how we were told, basically. And then now we've won our independence, and now we've kind of resurrected this government, and now what? Well, the world moves on, right? And so the biggest thing that happens is the French Revolution in 1789. And that really starts over a bread riot. It's not really in our scope to talk too much about it, but I would tell you this, that kind of everything that can go wrong does go wrong in the French Revolution. It is crazy. It is riots and murder and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it starts over bread prices. Imagine paying an entire day's labor to buy a single loaf of bread. Well, that's what happened in France, in part because of their losses in the French Indian War, in part because they didn't get a whole lot out of the American Revolution, and in part because, frankly, their monarchy is terrible, their government is terrible. And so while the king and queen are living it up in the Palace of Versailles, the people in Paris are starving, and they riot. And this forces them to have this gigantic meeting called the Estates Generales, where you have representatives from the nobility, the clergy, and the people, and they meet. And it's sort of democratic, and it kind of goes back to some similar things that England has done, although England did it better. In any case, they're going to meet. Well, after a few days of meeting, the nobility and the clergy literally lock out the regular people's representatives. So what they do is they go to the tennis courts nearby, and they resolve to create their own government, to create a democratic republic, kind of like America. Now, it won't be the same, but it'll be similar. A lot of the same ideas, right? The problem is they're not going to do it well. They're not going to cooperate. They're not going to get along. It's kind of a dictatorship by a mob, and the mob keeps changing, so the rules keep changing. I think France developed something like 16 or 18 constitutions over the next several years, and all of them will fail because about 1800 or so, Napoleon's going to come along and just take over the whole country as a dictator. But when the French Revolution happens, naturally, they want the United States to lend them support. They supported us. We are supposed to support them. That's that Treaty of Amity we signed in 1777. And George Washington says, well, we want to help you, but we're going to stay neutral, because what ends up happening is France goes to war with England. Kind of no better way to get everybody moving than to start a war. That's what the French Revolution does. And so the British are fighting against the French to try to keep their monarchy in place. Meanwhile, the French people want America's help to get rid of their monarchy. It's very confusing and difficult. Washington says, no, we're going to be neutral. In the end, the people kill the King of France. They behead him, and Washington essentially argues then, well, we had a treaty, but you killed the king, and so we don't have a treaty anymore. So we're not going to really help you. And so it's a mess. It's just hard to even explain. I mean, to the point where sometimes they're killing, the French are, as many as 800 people a day by guillotine in Paris. And these aren't just criminals. These are people who disagree with kind of how the mob is going. It's crazy. You want to get a good sense of how the French Revolution was, read a book by Charles Dickens called A Tale of Two Cities. It's great. And you'll just get this whole crazy ambiance about how it was. So anyway, he's got to deal with that for his entire presidency. The French Revolution and the wars that come out of it are going to last until 1815, mostly on, sometimes off. And they are going to impact the United States. They're going to impact Britain and Europe, and eventually embroil us in another war. Well, at home, we also have a whole series of Indian conflicts. And Washington sort of has to learn to deal with that. Remember, we don't really have an army or a navy. They were all but disbanded after the Revolutionary War. And so Washington will send various officers out into the West mainly. We would call it the Midwest today. It was the Northwest then. It was the Ohio Valley area around the Great Lakes, all of that. And usually the Indians would win until the army is sort of resurrected, because we needed an army to handle those situations. So again, the army was born in 1775, and it's sort of resurrected here. Remember, they don't like having a standing army because they're paranoid that an army leads to tyranny. Well, they realize they have to have a legitimate army in order to handle some of these issues. And so we have the kind of resurgence of that. We also have the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s. And that all comes about taxation. Of course, Americans have a real thing about taxation, right? Remember the motto, no taxation without representation, during the Revolution. Well, now they have representation, and now these people are complaining in the early 90s about taxes, and specifically this is a tax on whiskey, but it could be other taxes. And it was a tax that Alexander Hamilton suggested in his job as Secretary of Treasury. How do we get money? How does the government afford to pay for all the things that it needs to do? And so they levied a tax on alcohol. And Westerners seemed to be paying more taxes, and they complained about it, and they rioted, and they threatened to burn down Pittsburgh, and it got pretty messy. And George Washington basically says, no, enough is enough. You guys are wrong. And he personally leads an army of militiamen, about 13,000 people strong, to put this thing down. By the time he gets there, it's basically dissolved, and so nothing major happens. But it underscores that there are still a lot of problems in this country, but also how George Washington is going to, by force of will, hold this country together. So it's not all wine and roses. There are a lot of conflicts and difficulties just from trying to figure out what procedure should be to handling these huge foreign policy issues like the French Revolution and those wars, or handling internal issues like the Indian conflicts or the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, after 8 years, he's reelected again in 1792. 1792, and then in 1796 he informs everyone, I'm not running again. I don't want to be president anymore. I'm going to step down, and I'm going to leave it to somebody else. At this point, Washington's about 64 or 65 when he steps down. And that, of course, sets the stage for elections and new presidents and so on coming down the pipe. All right. So when we look at the election of 1876, we have to start by understanding that there are political parties that have been created during the time of Washington's presidency. You might have noticed that when I put Washington and the years he served, I did not put a party affiliation. It's because he really wasn't affiliated with the party. You could argue, I guess, that he was a Federalist, but officially he was nothing. What ends up happening is two parties are born during this period of Washington's presidency. And one group's called the Federalists, and the other is called the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans. And remember, in a previous lecture, I told you not to get confused when you hear this, because when we're talking Constitution, remember, we have Federalists and Anti-Federalists. That is all about yes or no on the Constitution. But when we're talking political parties, we have Federalists and Republicans, or Federalists and Democrat Republicans, all right? So if you hear them put together like that, again, Federalists and Anti-Federalists has to do with the Constitution. Federalists and Republicans has to do with political parties. What we end up with are two parties, and that's been what we've largely been stuck with ever since. And so the Federalist Party is sort of headed by Alexander Hamilton, okay? And he feels like the wealthy class should rule. There should be a strong federal government. There's an emphasis on business, manufacturing, factories, that kind of thing. And they sort of promote what we call a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Another term for that, and this might be on your test, is loose construction, all right? Loose construction. That is, the Constitution is a good document, but it wasn't meant to be all constraining. They favor the British, they favor a national bank, and protective tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on foreign goods that protect your goods. So let's say iron, you're going to levy a tariff on iron that comes from Britain, and that'll make the iron from America cheaper. Most people are going to buy American iron, right? But it's this bank issue that really kind of creates this situation between these two groups. Thomas Jefferson is the head or leader, if you will, of this Republican Party. And while I wouldn't say that he doesn't also believe that the wealthy class should rule, he does want it to be much more spread out, and he wants more people to have opportunity to become part of that ruling class. All of them would agree that the people that own America should govern America. In other words, you should have property or employment, something like that. And he favors a more strong state government system and an emphasis on agriculture. Well, naturally, he's a Virginian, right? Remember, not all the colonies function this way. And he has a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. We call that strict construction, all right? And he is a person who believes in the French. Remember, he spent a lot of time in France when he was younger during the American Revolution. He does not like the national bank. He favors state banks and he favors free trade. So let me talk about the bank real quick. It's called the Bank of the United States. Hamilton suggests that the U.S. create this entity called the Bank of the United States, and it will be a bank, not an arm of the government. It is a business that is supported by the U.S. government, and it's where the U.S. government puts its money and all of that. Jefferson will argue that's unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't give it that permission. The Constitution says Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper. And Jefferson says, see, now the bank's not necessary. We could do things differently. States, we can use the state banks. And so he has a very narrow or strict interpretation of the Constitution. And Hamilton says, well, that's true, I guess, but that's not really what was meant. That's not really the best thing. We need to take a more open view of how to interpret. So political parties really start because of a difference of opinion on how to interpret the Constitution. What's right, what's wrong? What can this government do? What can it not do? So remember, even though they signed the Constitution, even though it got ratified, not everybody agrees on how good it is or how it should actually work. And this is where political parties come from. So you have the Federalists and Hamilton and the Republicans and Jefferson, and those two guys are going to run their respective parties. But when it comes to the election, we're not going to have Alexander Hamilton running for president. And a big reason for that is because of his personality. I don't know about you, but I've known some people, I'm sure you have too. You know someone who just seems to rub everyone the wrong way. That's Alexander Hamilton. That's what he did. An example of that is during the Whiskey Rebellion, when the people out west were complaining about it. He said, well, you people just need to quit drinking so much, as if that was the problem. It made a lot of people angry. So even though he's sort of the brains behind the Federalist Party, he's not going to be the one running for president. John Adams, the vice president for Washington, will be the one who runs. And, of course, the Republican Party will put out Thomas Jefferson. Well, remember, the way the system works is the electors just write two names on a piece of paper, and whoever gets the most names is the president, and whoever gets the second most names is the vice president. And you can see here on this little electoral map that doesn't exactly give you the numbers, but it's almost split 50-50. John Adams barely wins, but Thomas Jefferson comes in second. And so now you have a Federalist president and a Republican vice president, and that's going to lead to a number of conflicts and friction over the next 4 years as John Adams then serves as the president. And I feel really bad for John Adams. One, I think John Adams gets a bit of a bad rap, in that he was a pretty good president. He wasn't perfect. No one was. George Washington isn't perfect. But John Adams suffers from what I call being the guy after the guy, right? George Washington is the guy. And I don't care who you are, if you come after George Washington, you're going to look like a bum. you're going to be a disappointment. If you're a sports fan, especially football or something, you kind of understand that you have a star quarterback, and then when he retires or leaves, it's hard to replace that guy. And it feels like no matter who that guy is, unless he wins 3 more Super Bowls, he's always going to be a bum. And that's kind of how John Adams is viewed. He's respected, but he's not well loved. It doesn't help that Washington is this great war hero. Washington is tall. Washington is elegant. Washington is handsome. And John Adams is short and sort of fat and sort of balding, as you can see, and he's sort of obnoxious. And so he doesn't exactly help himself either. A number of things happen, of course, during his presidency. One's called the XYZ affair, and this has to do with France. During the war, right, the war with France and Britain that Washington said we're going to be neutral in, our shipping comes under attack. Washington sent John Jay to get a treaty with the British. John Adams is going to try to get a treaty with the French. The problem is, because of the revolution, you never really know who's in charge in France. And so our agents keep getting shuffled around, and they're asked for bribes in order to kind of move them along to the next level. Well, our agents say, no, wait, we're not paying any bribes. And in America, this gets out. In America, the slogan comes out that says, millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. We're not going to give any bribe money to the French. And a lot of people want to go to war with France at this time. John Adams says, no, we're not going to war with anybody. He, like Washington, agrees we're not ready. Plus, the truth is, we're making money hand over fist, supplying goods to the French, the British, and all of their allies. We are making huge amounts of money, even as our shipping's coming under attack, and we'll talk more about that later. The whole American economy is growing by leaps and bounds. So because of this issue, and America kind of is angry, John Adams is able to, Congress again, but under John Adams' direction, is able to revamp the Navy. So again, the Navy was born in 1975 also, and kind of disbanded. Well, now we're going to rebuild the Navy. Congress puts aside money to build 40 warships. We're not going to build nearly that many. But the idea was we need the warships to protect our trade and to be able to sort of negotiate from a position of strength. And so that's why John Adams sometimes is called the father of the American Navy. Now, one of the really negative things that happened was the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those came out in 1798. Congress passed them. John Adams signed them. And Vice President Thomas Jefferson had a huge problem with them, especially with the way they were used. Basically, the Alien and Sedition Acts say, if you're fomenting rebellion in America, then you're going to get arrested and deported if you're a foreigner. And think about it, the French had people here trying to get support. The British were trying to get support. They were causing problems. And so the Alien Sedition Acts are designed and intended to deal with that issue. But they also say you can't write any negative or inflammatory stuff about the government. And again, the thrust of the law was directed at foreigners who were trying to incite Americans to either rebel or cause problems, but get involved in the war. And that makes sense. John Adams' people kind of used the Alien and Sedition Acts to shut down opposition to them. So Republican newspapers, we're all used to news outlets being left or right leaning or whatever the case is. And it's not any different than it was then. And actually people who are writing things about John Adams and so on, sometimes those guys get arrested. And again, Thomas Jefferson has a huge problem with this. This is violating their First Amendment. So what Jefferson does, along with James Madison, is they go on kind of a speaking tour in Virginia, their home state. They go to a new state, which is Kentucky, and they start talking about this law is unconstitutional. What should a state do if the federal government passes an unconstitutional law? And he sort of introduces this idea of states' rights, and states might be able to react differently to a law that the federal government passes that they don't like. And I think also that what really hurts John Adams probably is that Washington died right in the middle of his presidency. And so Washington, of course, had stepped down, in 1797 and said goodbye. And now here's John Adams. Washington is he's sort of promoted to be the ranking officer in the army during this period of time. And so there's all this threat, like we might go to war with France. So here's Washington, running around as a 66, 67-year-old guy and saying, hey, I'm ready to go if we need it. And then he gets sick, and then he died in 1799 in December. And, he died of pneumonia, basically, some kind of respiratory infection. They bled him. That was the common practice. You would remove blood. They probably removed too much. That probably contributed to his death. I mean, think about it. George Washington survived anthrax when he first became president. He survived smallpox as a child, survived it and lived through it, of course, during the smallpox epidemic during the war. He survived 2 wars without getting wounded. And all of this, then here he's laid low by basically the flu and poor medical practice. So he dies. Well, when he dies, America is going to have the most gigantic party you can imagine because he's that much loved. And here's poor John Adams, who no one loves, So all of that sort of creates a situation where John Adams is not looked on very highly or does not have a very good time. Someone said in a film I watched once that he might have been the most personally deserving to be president, but maybe the most personally unsuited. In other words, his personality was not great. So in 1800, we're going to have another election, of course. It'll be John Adams running against his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Only this time, the political parties are a little bit more ready, and they all get their guy elected. And so every elector that voted for Thomas Jefferson also voted for Aaron Burr. You can see on the screen here, they both got 73 votes. The intent was Jefferson would be the president, Aaron Burr would be the vice president, and you can see Adams and Pinckney. Pinckney was supposed to be the vice president, but something happened in the Republican votes. They didn't vote one less for Aaron Burr like they were supposed to, and they tied. And that means when you have a tie, that means it goes to the House of Representatives to figure out who's the president. So the House then casts votes, and they cast something like 36 different votes to break this tie. What Aaron Burr was supposed to do was step down and say, oh no, I'm not the president, right? And so that would have been easy. But Aaron Burr goes, haha, maybe I can be the president. You can imagine when Jefferson is declared the winner, he's not real happy with Aaron Burr, okay? But you can see, again, just like in 1796, the vote is essentially split 50-50. Welcome to America. That's how it's going to be much of the time. Very rarely are we going to have a president who gets a large number of votes. It does happen, but not super often. Well, a couple words about Aaron Burr real quick before we move on. Aaron Burr is not done being crazy. Is not done being someone who you can't trust, all right? One of the things that happened during this House vote was Alexander Hamilton sort of appears and says, don't vote for Aaron Burr because he's like a little Caesar. And Hamilton wasn't referring to bad pizza, right? He was referring to Julius Caesar, one of the men who basically destroyed the Roman Republic and helped create the empire. And in early America, when you called someone a little Caesar, that was a bad name. Well, that makes, him very angry. That makes Aaron Burr very angry. A few years later, there are actually some northern states that are thinking about trying to leave the Union. They don't like Jefferson as president. They don't like the direction things have taken. It's called the Hartford Convention, and they will meet. One of the things they do is they try to get Aaron Burr on their side, and he does join their side, and he runs for governor of New York. Well, Alexander Hamilton pops up again and says, don't vote for this guy. He's a little Caesar. And at that point, Aaron Burr is so angry, he challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel of pistols. And so they go to New Jersey. That's where you go to do everything illegal, right? Dueling's illegal. And now the Vice President of the United States and the former Secretary of Treasury of the United States, both of these guys are founding fathers and heroes in their own way. And they're going to go to New Jersey and they're going to have a duel. And in the end, Aaron Burr is going to shoot Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton's going to die. The problem is no one watched the duel because no one wanted to, right? Plausible deniability. And so Adams is still the vice president. And then also later on, after we purchase Louisiana, which we'll get to in a minute, Aaron Burr is going to be involved in a plot to separate the part of the Louisiana Territory from the United States. And eventually he gets arrested. He gets arrested with 80 armed men, and they say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, we were just out hunting." Of course, he goes to trial, but the Supreme Court does not find him guilty of treason, but they do boot him out of the country for most of the rest of his life. So Aaron Burr is one of these guys that some people say, no, he's a great patriot. Others say he's a bad guy. I'll let you decide. When the 1800 election, of course, Jefferson will be declared the winner. He will serve 2 terms. And so one thing here, Washington stepped down after 2 terms. Every president who wins 2 terms until World War II, until 1940 actually, is going to step down from being president. There is not a law, there's no rule that says you can't serve to be president as long as you are able or as long as you're voted. Obviously, Washington would have been voted in again had he wanted to, but he said, no, I need to leave. I think he felt the years, 8 years being president makes one old. And you all note that President Obama looked pretty old after his 8 years. President Bush looked old. President Clinton looked old. So it wears you out. And he set a precedent that we need to keep this moving. We need new people in here doing it. So here's Jefferson. He's going to step down after 2 terms also. Sometimes this is referred to as the Revolution of 1800. We have the transfer of power from one political party to another political party, and nobody died. And in Europe, that's pretty crazy because people die when power is exchanged, right? And so that sets the tone. You and I, again, are used to that. Every 8 or 12 years, usually, the presidency switches sides from one party to the other. They shake hands. It's no big deal. Everyone that's retired is friends. And we argue about it and yell about it. But, it's the way it is. And we're used to it. We expect that. We expect that there would be no bloodshed. So Jefferson has a very different way of doing things, right? He's a strict constructionist, strict interpretation of the Constitution, where Adams was not. Kind of a funny story, he's given this thing called the Mammoth cheese. It was a 1,200-pound cheese that was given to him after he took office. And basically the idea was this cheese was made by farmers without the help of any Federalist cows. It was sort of a joke. But it's a 1,200-pound cheese, and the word is that they ate that thing for the next 3 years. And they parked it somewhere in the White House, the new presidential mansion that, again, didn't exist when Washington was there, but was built during Adams's presidency. Adams moved into it, now Jefferson. Kind of ironic, I guess, that Washington's the only president who never served or lived in Washington. Washington started building it, but he never got to live there. So we have this cheese. You can't make this stuff up. Now, some of the big events that happened during Jefferson's presidency are the Louisiana Purchase, which of course then spawns the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Here you see on this map a depiction of it. So the blue part is the territory that the United States had as a result of the American Revolution. You might note that we've added 3 states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, and a couple of territories, Mississippi and Indiana territories. You can see Maine up there is not a state yet, but that blue area is what we had. In 1803, the United States is going to purchase this brown area called the Louisiana Purchase. And what happens is, you see the Mississippi River down there right in between. When Jefferson becomes president, he realizes how important the Mississippi River is to our Western trade, our Westerners. And we had a deal with Spain at the time to share the Mississippi, to share New Orleans. Everything was great. But when Napoleon took over France, he invaded Spain and he took over this area. Okay? And I don't know exactly how it worked out this way because Spain kept some area and France kept this brown area. And so what Jefferson does is he sends diplomats to France to try to sign a treaty about the Mississippi, maybe to buy New Orleans, just something so that we can guarantee or assure ourselves that we can use the Mississippi. And in the process of all of this, in the process of Napoleon becoming the leader of France, There is a revolution in Haiti that cost the French a lot of soldiers, a slave revolution. And by the time these guys get to Napoleon, Napoleon basically says, hey, how about I sell you this whole thing for $15 million? They were actually authorized to pay $10 million to buy New Orleans. Well, Napoleon says, it's all rocks and trees anyway. There's just Indians and bears in there. It's not doing anything for me. I'll sell it to you for 15 million. The Americans' eyes got real big and they said, yes, let's do that. So that's how it happened. Maybe the biggest land deal in history. I think that was 3 cents an acre is what it ended up costing. That's crazy. But you can see we doubled the size of the United States right there, right? Now, the principal reason was to get control of the Mississippi. All the rest of this territory is gravy. Now, Jefferson's a curious sort, and he wants to know what's going on, so he commissions the Lewis and Clark expedition a year or so later, and you can see the path they took on this map. They go up the Missouri River, and they're kind of looking for, is there a way to use water to go from one side of the country to the other? The answer to that is no. There is no such thing as a so-called Northwest Passage. But they do take this 3-year-long trip, about 50 guys, Lewis, Clark, and a bunch of others, and they raft and walk a lot of it. This is where they meet Sacagawea, and she helps them out. I don't know what it is with young Indian girls helping out Americans, but they keep doing that, right? Pocahontas, now Sacagawea. And their job is to explore. Their job is to take notes and take samples of everything. Again, Jefferson's kind of a scientist. He likes to know stuff. And they're going to send stuff back. They're going to send a couple of bears back and all sorts of things. They're going to go all the way to essentially what is Portland, Oregon today. And then they're going to come all the way back. And the film you watch, I think it's the third film, basically says that this trip was the equivalent of the moon landings in 1969, that it was a big, big deal. So that's how all that comes about. Again, the film will talk much more about that. So this was huge. We've just doubled the size of the United States. Notice most of the area that is known as Texas remains with Spain, right? So a few other things that happened. The Barbary Pirates episode, which is where there are these pirate nations in northern Africa who basically control the southern Atlantic and part of the Mediterranean, especially now that the British and French are at war again. And the Americans had signed a treaty with them, but it cost us a ton of money. We were essentially paying protection money to these Muslim pirate nations in northern Africa, like Tripoli and so on. And it was costing us like 20% of our national income by the time Jefferson became president. And Jefferson's kind of a notorious tightwad, and he says, no, we're not doing that anymore. Well, this leads to a bunch of conflict, and in the end, we're going to invade Tripoli, Africa, and sort of impose our will on it and get out of a lot of those deals. And of course, once the Napoleonic Wars are over, all of that will be handled by the Europeans, and that won't be a problem anymore. So it's kind of an interesting story. Our Navy gets some experience in battle. The Marine Corps, of course, lands there. We take over this little country, this little city. We raise the American flag. It's why the Marines sing "From the Halls of Montezuma to the Shores of Tripoli." That refers to their invasion of Mexico in 1846 and 47, and of course the Shores of Tripoli is the invasion here during the Barbary Pirates situation. But again, the backdrop of all of this are what we now call the Napoleonic Wars. You have the French Revolutionary Wars, which morph into the Napoleonic Wars, where he's trying to take over Europe, right? He's trying to recreate this new Roman empire, right? And he's doing quite well at it, and he's basically fighting against everyone else, and he's winning. But the British still have a bigger navy, and the British are still attacking our shipping and causing us problems, and so this is annoying. The British are also doing something called impressment, where they are basically shanghaiing men to serve in the British Navy. The British have a law that says the British Navy can draft, if you will, any able-bodied British male to serve in the British Navy. And they would do that by clocking people over the head or picking up drunks or whatever, and you'd wake up the next morning on board the HMS Majestic, or some ship and they would say, "Good morning, what's your name? You're in the Navy now," and you would serve. People didn't like to serve in the Navy because it was difficult. The discipline was harsh. The odds of getting killed were high, right? Remember, this is the period of time where ships would sail up next to each other and blast each other with cannons, right? It's crazy. In any case, the problem arises because how do the British tell the difference between an American sailor and a British sailor? In 1805, they can't, right? They basically sound and look the same. So the British just take everybody that seems British. And the word is there's something like 5,000 Americans serving in the British Navy during this period of time. And they have no choice. And that's called impressment. So this, of course, Jefferson takes huge exception to this. One of the problems, though, is when Jefferson became president, he stopped building all those warships. He said, we're not going to do that. It's terrible. It's cost too much money. Debt's bad and all this kind of stuff. So we end up not having enough to deal with it. So we turn to commercial warfare and something called the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically says we're not going to trade anything with anybody, or rather, we're not going to sell anything to anybody. It's kind of a boycott, like an opposite of a boycott. Britain and France are terrorizing our shipping, so we're going to stop selling them everything, and we're going to make them come to terms with us. Well, instead, what happens is it creates a depression in America. Everybody's angry. Everybody starts blaming the British. They don't blame Jefferson, and they don't blame Congress when it's actually their fault. And of course, Jefferson's in the last year or two of his presidency, but it does wipe out the entire economy for a couple of years, few years. And this starts making people very angry. And so when James Madison becomes our next president in the 1808 election, and he wins pretty easily, the Embargo Acts will get repealed and replaced with something called the Non-Intercourse Act, which just says, okay, we can sell stuff to everybody except the British and the French, but that doesn't work either. And eventually they'll repeal those, and we'll start selling back to the British and the French, but they're still attacking our shipping and still impressing our sailors, and it's all those same problems are still there. One kind of curious thing about James Madison is his wife, Dolly Madison. So Jefferson's wife had died, so he didn't have a first lady. And so now you have this first lady who's super popular, vivacious, beautiful, had parties all the time. Everybody loved her. And it's kind of well known about the parties they had. Here's Madison, this sort of stoic. He does have a pretty rough sense of humor, but he's pretty stoic. Kind of a fun fact here, the favorite flavor of ice cream during President Madison's reign in the White House was not chocolate or vanilla or strawberry or anything. It was oyster. And I'll just leave that little tidbit with you. The thing Madison has to contend with, and the biggest thing that happens during his presidency, is the War of 1812, which we'll get to in a minute. So we want to talk about war hawks. War hawks are politicians, usually they're younger, but not always, but in this case they're usually younger, who believe that we must go to war with Britain to win our independence again. The thinking is Britain's imposing their will on our sailors, they're impressing our sailors, they're attacking our shipping, and they're taxing us effectively. And so these younger politicians are saying they're doing it again, and the only way we can break free of this is to fight them again. Just something to keep in mind. These are younger politicians. These are men who didn't really have much to do with the American Revolution. They might have grown up during that period of time. They certainly have heard about it from their parents and their grandparents. And the impression is we beat the British. But remember, we didn't. They sued for peace because they were tired of fighting, but they still had the upper hand. We didn't beat them up too bad. These guys are saying, we have two choices, America. You ever heard this? We have two choices. We can go to war and fight for our independence again, or we can lay down and be slaves to the British. That's called a false dilemma. It's classic. What are you going to pick, right? Every red-blooded American is going to want to go to war and fight for freedom. Now, there's a third option. Maybe we go to war with Britain against the French because Napoleon's really the major problem. That's an idea. Maybe we don't go to war and they're just overstating the fact that we're slaves to the British, which they totally were. But they convince a lot of people in Congress, and in 1812, we are going to declare war on the British while they are involved in a war in Europe. And the farmers are thinking, hey, The British are busy. We can attack Canada and we can attack Florida, which was kind of owned by Spain at the time, and we can get all that territory and they'll never be able to do anything about it. And again, you have the Warhawks saying, we've got to fight for our freedom. So there's economic issues, right? The economy is bad because of the Embargo Act, although it's improved a bit. And so we declare war on Britain. We're totally unprepared, but we're going to do real well at first because Britain doesn't really expect it. We kind of blindside them, all right? But we're going to invade Canada, or try to, but because we have very small army and a large militia, it doesn't work. Militia units are not soldiers. Many militia units refuse to leave their own states, so on. It's a mess, all right? In the midst of this, there's something called the Shawnee Rebellion or insurrection under a man named Tecumseh, who was this great Shawnee chief, and his brother Tenskwatawa, who was the medicine man. And these two together were able to form a large confederation of natives out in the West who were fighting against the United States. And so we'll have to deal with that situation too. Men like William Harrison and Andrew Jackson, whose actual picture you see here, he's the guy standing in the middle with the sword, and others are involved in that. But then they will get, that happens as we then get into the War of 1812. Now that insurrection will end. Harrison and others do defeat the natives. They kind of keep this war out on the frontier. Tecumseh will get killed eventually, and this will sort of die down. But this kind of conflict kind of comes and goes, right? Washington had challenges, and Adams and Jefferson and Madison. I mean, that Indian issue is an ongoing issue. So we're going to get involved in this war. The British are actually going to invade the United States. And sometimes you might hear the United States has never been invaded, but we have. The British invaded us. We were doing terrible in this war. And I mean, we're lucky we didn't lose outright. They invaded the United States. One point, they actually landed in Washington City and burned it down. They burned down the White House. President Madison had to flee the city. President Madison is the only president that fought in a war physically while he was president. Of course, we've had a lot of presidents who were soldiers or sailors, but he actually fought against the British, commanding some gun emplacements while they were invading, and eventually they all had to flee. The admiral of the fleet, the British fleet, walks into the White House and steals some souvenirs from the president's bedroom, and then they set the place on fire. But ultimately, what happens is the British defeat Napoleon in 1814, and then they turn around and say, why are we fighting with the United States? And they ask for peace. And so we end up with this Treaty of Ghent, which takes a while to unfold. One of the challenges is while they're negotiating the terms for peace, Napoleon comes back. He escapes from his imprisonment. He comes back and he starts the war again. But a lot of battle plans were already in place. So the British had already decided to invade New Orleans. And when they asked for peace, it was too late for them to stop the invasion. And so we have this huge battle called the Battle of New Orleans in 1814, which is what this picture is kind of depicting. And a young Andrew Jackson is given the task to go defend New Orleans against the British, who we know are going to invade from Jamaica. And so he does. He goes down there, and he not just defends New Orleans from the British, he crushes the British. It's a huge victory. There's a great story there because Jackson brings this army from Tennessee down into New Orleans, and the people of New Orleans tell him to leave. They don't want him there. Jackson says, no, this is my job. I have to be here. And they say, get out. So Jackson orders his men to turn all their guns on the city, and he says, okay, here's how it's going to go. You're going to let me in, and we're going to defend the city from the British, or I'm going to blow this city to pieces, and then I'm going to come in and defend what's left of it from the British. It's your choice. Well, obviously they let him in. But this gives you a little insight into Andrew Jackson, someone we're going to talk a lot about in the next few lectures. His nickname is Old Hickory. He's that general that you hate him, but you love him at the same time because he's so tough, but he wins. Out of this battle comes the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. As Fort McHenry was being bombarded, Francis Scott Key was trying to secure the release of a bunch of prisoners. By the way, way more people in this war died of smallpox, on both sides, then died in the war itself. That's pretty common. Anyway, we get this song, or at least the words to the song, during this particular war, which much later becomes our national anthem. So that's it for the lecture. All right. This is the end of the lecture for this exam. And so don't be this guy who has no idea what he's doing when he takes the exam. So I'm going to just lay it out right here. I just did an announcement for it recently. So make sure that you've watched all of these lectures up to this one and you've taken your notes. All of this material is fair game for the test. That's one. Make sure that you've turned in all of your Voices of Freedom assignments up through this point. Those are fair game for the test. Make sure you've defined all the key terms in those chapters. You're definitely getting tested on those things. And make sure you've watched the videos, the first 3 videos, or the appropriate videos, whatever's on the schedule, and filled out the PDFs that go with them. All 4 of those things are what's on this exam. And so you're responsible to make sure you have that. And of course, if you don't want to do any of that, you could just play some of the Assassin's Creed games, and you'll probably get a lot of this anyway, especially Assassin's Creed 3, right? I thought it was cool. Anyway, good luck and have a good one.